Welcome to Book Backstory. My name is Carla Brandenburg, and I'm an award-winning author of romantic suspense and paranormal novels. This podcast is a walk along my journey. I plan to interview some of my favorite authors, share with you some of the things that get me excited to write a book, and the stumbling blocks during the process. In this podcast, I'm going to share my most recent insights into developmental editing. I've just completed Enchanted Memories, the fifth in the Hillendale series. I've spent the last couple of weeks going through it to prepare it for my editor. This includes pulling out overused and filler words, punctuation, grammar, the usual self-editing steps. It also includes reading through it start to finish, sometimes multiple times. In this case, I made more passes than normal, mostly because I kept finding places I'd screwed something up. Normally when I'm writing, if I come across a place where I switch course, a new direction that I hadn't planned on, I stop and go back from the beginning to make sure I weave the necessary details in so that the story tracks. With this book, I was anxious to get to the end, so I didn't stop longer than to make notes of things to remember to include when I went back over it. Big mistake. Once I'd done my copy editing pass, I went back to do my developmental pass. Usually it's the other way around. Develop the story first, then clean up the mess. In my mind, I'd addressed all the new elements based on the notes I'd left for myself. But as I started to read through the story from beginning to end, I stumbled. Let me give you an example. Madeline Stevens is a psychic detective. The police have asked her to help them find a missing person, and as the clues are disclosed, we find out this missing person went to Las Vegas for a quickie wedding. At least that's the assumption. While chasing down leads, one of the police officers checks for newly issued marriage licenses. None were issued for the missing woman. This is an example of who knows what when. My initial thought when writing was that the missing woman did go to Las Vegas for a quickie wedding. Later, I changed my mind. As I'm reading through the completed version of the story, Madeline comments that the missing person didn't actually get married, but she doesn't know that yet. The police officer hasn't relayed that information. Who knows what when? Frustrated, I went back and noted when the information is given out. There are places where a character walks away, and 3 paragraphs later, she walks away again. Got all the way through reading it, fixed the mistakes I'd identified, set it aside, and went back at it a couple of days later. Every time you edit, you risk screwing something new up. Wouldn't you know it? I still had references to that silly marriage license before it was proven not to exist. Fixed it yet again, and as I continued, I ran into another spot where the canine in the story is in the car waiting. And then the characters return home, assumably with the dog, and the dog is barking in the house. Teleportation? I don't think so. There's another spot where Kyle invites Madeline to his house for dinner. Discussion ensues. Ultimately, she asks if he has a bottle of wine and goes over. As originally written, they sit down and have a drink together. No big deal, right? Except he's a policeman and about to go on shift. He's also a bit of a Boy Scout, so he isn't likely to have a glass of wine before work. Oh, if that were the only problem. This interplay crosses 3 chapters, and they never do eat dinner before he goes to work. Ultimately, I decided we don't need to know whether or not they ate dinner, but I did take the wine glass out of his hand. Continuity and flow. Nothing is more frustrating than being sure you've addressed something and it's still out of whack. One of my most common errors is time. I've taken to writing with a calendar beside me so I can track which day is which. I've been known to miss a day or move backward in time. In this book, I didn't make any specific references to days of the week, so that was one less worry for me. The book is with my editor now, so we'll see what I still missed when she's done with it. One of the things I do when I finish writing a book is take a break to read. I'd saved a book by one of my favorite authors, and while I was reading, because I was in hyper-editing mode, I found several oopsies in her book. a couple of typos, 2 sentences in a row that started with but. You're not supposed to start sentences with but, and yet we do. She's published by William Morrow. When I see things like that, it helps me relax about the things I miss. It also reminds me that sometimes during editing, we run the risk of silencing our own voice in the name of scrubbing the manuscript clean. What the heck does that mean? I'll give you an example using this author first. I can guarantee you, drinking game anyone, that somewhere in her book, one character will confess how they feel, and the other character will respond with, same. Simply that. Same. My critique group would call her out. It's repetitive in her books, but it's her voice, even across multiple books and characters that might not think or speak the same way. You will find the same sort of interchange in every one of her books. An example from me? There's a spot in my book where the dog snuggies up against his handler's leg. My critique group commented on snuggies as a mistake. Have you ever seen a dog heel? I chose that word on purpose, and that word is staying in unless my editor kicks it out. But I'm prepared to defend my position with her as well. She gives me more latitude with voice. So here I sit, waiting to see what my editor finds that I missed. That's my insight into the editing process for the day. As with children, every book is different, but cleaning up after them is usually pretty standard. Let's take a minute to talk about auditory proofing. Proofreading is by far the most tedious part of writing, and I generally take several passes so I can get a different look at it each time, looking for different things. When I do an auditory proof, I let the computer read the story back to me. Unlike with an audiobook, the narrator speaks in a monotone, and yes, he drones on. You can switch voices for variety, but I find his unique pronunciations are enough to keep me on my toes. Hearing the wrong word will immediately create dissonance and call your attention to a mistake, but the narrator has his fair share of right words that he reads wrong. My computer says his name is David, although my critique partner and I refer to him as Fred. Fred has actually taught me a thing or two, like the proper way to pronounce triquetra. Or is that triquetra?
The triquetra on Madeline's chimney.
I actually had to check to see if he got it right, and learned I had been pronouncing it wrong the whole time. But I've discovered those instances are few and far between. In fact, he has a whole slew of words he uses alternate pronunciations for, and those are the things that keep your attention. The "he said what now" moments. Hearing the word wrong keeps me engaged. Hiccups that keep me from nodding off. For instance, English is full of heteronyms, words that are spelled the same but have different meanings, words like polish and Polish. But for Fred, you will hear him say read even as past tense.
It's like you read my mind.
Other words he reads the same, regardless of context, are live, live. Regardless of what your usage is, he reads one but not the other. Like wind or wind, dove or dove, close or close, bow or bow, complex or complex, and presence or presents. The nurse in my book, The Twins, takes care of invalids, or is that invalids? Numbers are also a crapshoot. He might say 911, or he might say 911, or more likely, 9-1-1.
I appreciate your candor. And the 4-1-1.
Where there are dashes, he doesn't pause but skips right past them. And he doesn't recognize italics for emphasis. Another interesting thing is when he isn't familiar with a term, he might spell it. For instance, becomes UMM.
She looks just like Aunt Charlotte UMM. I mean, your mother, Bryn.
And if you use letters that can be confused as Roman numerals, you're likely to get the number rather than the letters. And IV becomes 4. PI, the abbreviation for private investigator, becomes PI.
I'm going to contact the PI to see what he knows.
No one said the English language was easy. The thing he'll get wrong most often, though, is a character name. In Coyote Legacy, my characters' names are Devon Syke and Nasha. This is how Fred interprets them.
Nazca. I'm Captain CK.
And let's not forget Siobhan from Epitaph 2, the twins. I knew I was taking a risk with a name that is spelled oddly with regards to pronunciation, but it is a fairly common Irish name. Back when I was young, there was a soap opera called Ryan's Hope with a whole bunch of fun Irish names. Siobhan was one of them. But Fred, I guess he isn't familiar with ethnic names.
Siobhan McCormick strolled to her office from the hospital cafeteria.
He also gets confused with regular pronunciation versus possessive.
I know a place, Ian whispered. Ian's mint, Madeline, Madeline's.
But if there's a name he flat out doesn't know, point of reference, I pulled a name from an acquaintance to use in unintended consequences. I needed something out of the ordinary and something with a mythical or magical twist to it. So I chose Narcissa, Narcy for short. Fred seems to be familiar with Narcissa, but I actually choked the first time I heard him use her nickname.
The name she'd written was Narcissa Gravel Lace Narky.
Then there are the words he interprets as abbreviations. I ended a sentence with sat, and this is what Fred read back to me.
He dropped to his knees in front of where Madeline Saturday you are nothing like Bryn.
Likewise, he'll read, wait a sec, as wait a section. I also shook my head to make sure I heard him right when he read an I as one. I checked the text and actually retyped the I to make sure it wasn't really a one in disguise. Nope, just Fred being cheeky. So yes, listening to a monotone voice read the words back is monotonous. But his stumbling blocks or program choice for pronunciation keeps me on my toes to make sure it's him and not me that's gotten it wrong. And every now and then, I learn something new. Thanks for spending time with me. If you're an author and want to share what excites you about your most recent project, I'd love to have you join me on Books Backstory. Contact me at carla@carlabrandenburg.com. Until next time.